On December 18, 1994, in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, 27-year-old Alison Botha was abducted, raped, disemboweled, stabbed 36 times, and nearly decapitated. She lay there with her intestines outside her body on the ground and her neck almost completely severed. That night, she refused to succumb to death and fought back. Alison recognized the gaping wound in her abdomen and saw her intestines spilling out. To the best of her ability, she tucked them inside using a denim shirt. Miraculously, she managed to stand up, but as she did, her head began to tilt backward as she realized she had been nearly decapitated. To stabilize herself, she held her head up with one hand and her abdomen with the other. Inch by inch, she moved towards the main road where she awaited her angels to save her. Welcome to World of Crime. This is an unbelievable story of Alison Botha. Port Elizabeth, South Africa is the site of Botha Alison's birth on September 22, 1967. At the age of 10, she was thrust into a household with her mother and older brother Neil as a result of her parents' divorce. In 1985, while attending Collegiate Girls High School in Port Elizabeth, she served as head girl. After finishing high school, she spent a few years working and traveling across the world, settling in the US, UK, and Israel. As time went on, Alison returned to South Africa and earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Wilmington University. The main offender, Frans du Toit, was born to a police officer in Alawal, North South Africa, on July 6, 1968, and grew up in a devout Christian home. After joining a bad crowd and beginning drug experiments at the age of 13, Frans lost control of his life during adolescence. When he burned down his school, citing heavy metal music as the cause, his rebellious phase reached a fever pitch. The expulsion from school prompted his family to move to Port Elizabeth, a coastal city in southern South Africa. After moving to this new metropolis, Frans fell into Satanism and began to worship Satan. Frans joined the army after reaching the age of 18, although he spent much of his time detained due to his disorderly conduct. He left the army at 20 years of age, found employment as a miner, and wed a female not long after. Frans abandoned his wife and daughter shortly after she was born. Here we have Theuns Kruger, a disturbed 19-year-old man. Although he was born in Port Elizabeth, South Africa in 1975, Kruger had a challenging upbringing. When compared to his peers' childhoods, Kruger's was far from comfortable. He was born to a mother who was a drug addict and a criminal father who disappeared the moment she got pregnant. On her third marriage, Kruger's mother wed a violent guy who had a history of abusing him. Since he never felt like he belonged anywhere, Kruger often ran away. When Kruger was 15 years old, he began misusing drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism and stopped attending school. Frans and Kruger met in June 1994. Being in the service, dropping out of school, and seeing satanic witches brought them closer together, and they got along famously. There was a possibility that Frans's 1994 sexual attack was not his first. On his own, he approached a student in her car outside a pizza joint in Port Elizabeth. She was 20 years old. Frans raped the lady after gaining access to her car with a rifle. They then went to a rural region. Following this heinous attack, the young woman was in a tremendous deal of pain. Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger are a dangerous duo, and Alison will soon find out why. Alison and her friends returned to her flat for the afternoon on December 18, 1994, after a wonderful day at the beach. Around 1 in the morning, Alison's companions departed, but she was concerned about the last friend who did not have a ride home, so Alison offered a ride. After dropping off her companion, she came back to find her normal parking place occupied, so Alison had to park on a lonely, dark street. As she turned off the engine, a slender guy named Frans swung open the driver's side door, brandishing a knife. Frans reassured Alison that he only required her vehicle for an hour before ordering her to move over, and Alison was terrified. She gave Frans a false name, Susan, when asked for her real name. Frans pretended to be Clinton while they swapped fictitious identities. In an effort to shield herself, Alison said that she and her partner lived together. Still, Frans kept on speaking in a very informal tone. By giving the impression that someone was waiting for her at home, Alison intended to frighten him away. Frans picked up another man before venturing into the deserted outskirts of the city. Alison felt a chill go down her spine as she saw Kruger get into the car and caught sight of his lifeless gaze in the rearview mirror. Frans took them to a remote area on the outskirts of Port Elizabeth, far from any human activity or traffic. Soon after, he veered onto an isolated dirt road that was covered in sand. Kruger walked outside to have a smoke while Frans and Alison remained in the car. Alison voiced her concern to Frans, asking, "What now?" in the eerie quiet. Frans revealed their sinister plot in a terrifying confession, saying they were only there for sex. Because she had no idea how she would escape, Alison pleaded for it not to happen. Alison felt it would be difficult to fight with Frans brandishing a knife, but Frans asked her gently if she would. Just saying, "No," was her response. Kruger stands outside the vehicle, observing everything through the glass, while Frans proceeds to rape Alison. Since Frans had lied about his identity previously, this time they discussed the possibility of killing Alison while using their real identities. Alison made a mental note of their actual names. As Frans tried to strangle her, Alison fought back and pleaded for her own life. The strangulation resulted in a loss of bodily functions, and Alison inadvertently evacuated her bowels, which is crucial information to remember. As this is happening, Frans cuts off Alison's breath supply by strangling her so hard that he smashes her windpipe. The strangulation caused her to drift in and out of consciousness, but she was still alive. Frans, frustrated that she didn't die, drew his knife and stabbed Alison 37 times in the stomach and private parts. The flesh was torn wide open and her organs exposed. They were certain that she was dead until Alison's leg twitched. So in a final bid to end Alison's life, the pair ruthlessly inflicted an additional 17 stab wounds directly to her neck. However, Frans accidentally pierced her windpipe, allowing her to breathe as he repeatedly cut her throat, intending to inflict additional pain. Alison regained consciousness amidst the chaos, but she claimed to be dead. Frans and Kruger agreed that she wouldn't make it with such kinds of wounds after discussing the matter. Assuming Alison would succumb to her injuries, they sped away. After being left for dead in the middle of nowhere, Alison was severely wounded, nude, and on the brink of death. Realizing she would not survive, trying to breathe with a gaping cut in her neck, she had a selfless thought. With all her last power, she scribbled Frans and Theuns on the sand so the police could identify her assailants. Alison, who was resolute in her refusal to allow those two guys to take her life, lay there, anticipating death, and pondered whether she could endure a little longer. Alison felt something damp close to her legs as she fought to stand. The sight of her bulging intestines terrified her. Frans had tossed her garments on the floor, so she snatched her shirt and made a makeshift sling out of it to hold her intestines in place. Alison felt utterly bewildered and disoriented once she managed to get up. But after standing up, her head unexpectedly shifted backward, and her vision faded in and out. Her attackers had sliced into her neck so extensively that she was nearly decapitated. She had no choice but to walk with one hand supporting her intestines and the other holding her head in place. With extreme caution, Alison strode slowly toward the main road, as if she were undertaking the longest trek of her life. The full moon that night was big and clear, which was a blessing for Alison. Overwhelmed by fatigue, she fell to the ground on the main road. She remembers a car approaching shortly after that, slowing down, but then continuing once they saw her naked, bloodied, brutalized body. Thankfully, another car with Johannesburg students pulled over after the first one sped by without helping. The choice to save Alison was taken by Tian Eilerd, a 20-year-old veterinary medical student. On the side of the road, wounded and unclothed, Tian found Alison. He noted her pulse and bloodshot eyes as a veterinary student, but she was still awake. As a group, Tian and his pals bandaged her wounds using his shirt. An ambulance was requested via a mobile phone, which was unusual in 1994. Additionally, Tian realigned Alison's thyroid to reduce blood loss. Despite waiting for the ambulance for over 40 minutes, Tian fretted about the delay and kept Alison awake. As onlookers flocked to Tian, he maintained his composure. He tried to keep Alison awake by squeezing her hand as a kind of communication. After what seemed like an eternity, the ambulance finally arrived. Even though Alison's pulse was faint, Theuns persisted in encouraging her. She refused to let Theuns get in the ambulance without him. Upon examining Alison, the medical staff was shocked. Dr. Alexander Angelov later said that he'd never seen such severe injuries in his 16 years of practicing medicine. Despite being stabbed over 50 times, miraculously none of them had any vital organs or arteries. And since her intestines had been emptied as a result of being strangled, her abdominal cavity never turned septic. Defying all expectations. Alison managed to survive the extensive 3-hour surgery. During her brief stay in the ICU, Alison was monitored closely. The police returned in the afternoon and said that the prosecutors wanted Alison to verbalize Frans and Theuns' names to build a stronger case. The doctors were horrified because for her to talk, they had to remove the tube from her lungs through her trachea that had just been operated on because it was going through her vocal cords. But Alison was so brave and determined. She wrote on a paper asking the doctor to take the tube out. So they took it out and she told the police that her attackers were Frans and Theuns. Alison wished that the arrest of Frans and Theuns would prevent them from harming anybody else. Frans and Theuns were already under suspicion owing to their criminal records, but she firmly identified them to the police. Frans and Theuns were surprised to hear about the allegations because they had no idea Alison had survived. They spoke clean about their attempts at murder and rape. Until their trials, both were detained in custody. The upcoming trial was something that everyone was looking forward to. The South African people rallied around Alison as her tale made headlines. After enduring trauma, Alison vowed to come up and encourage other women to do the same. After waiting 6 months following the assault in June 1995, Alison finally testified against Theuns Kruger and Frans du Toit in June of that year. Frans showed no regret when testifying and instead placed the responsibility on demons. Neither did Kruger express any feelings. He remained silent. After their convictions, Kruger received 1 life sentence and Frans received 3. Alison suffered from despair after the trial until she met a guy at a friend's party. After they were married, Alison became pregnant a few years later, much to the surprise of her physicians, who had previously expressed worry about her fertility. The pregnancy and delivery of Alison's kid were both successful. The protagonist, Theuns, went from being a veterinary student to a doctor after Alison's tragedy. Alison became pregnant again around 10 years later. This time, Theuns helped birth her kid. Alison turned her traumatic experience into a positive by traveling to over 35 countries to share her story and provide assistance to other survivors. Since then, Botha has written 2 books. In 2016, her survival story was brought to life in the movie Alison. And today, she's still considered one of the most inspiring motivational speakers in the world. Frans and Kruger were both given parole in July 2023, less than 30 years after their sentencing, despite earlier assurances that they would not. After 28 years behind bars on 4th of July 2023, Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger were released on parole by the Department of Correctional Services, DCS, without following the proper process and with a total disregard for Alison's rights. In light of this situation, what are your feelings? In what ways does their release seem to you? In your opinion, will they go back to the streets and go on as before? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Thank you for watching.